on what's best for the Libyan people and how can we make sure that we're minimizing the harm to innocent civilians during this process. Throughout all this, we will continue to send the clear message that it's time for Gaddafi to go. One of the extraordinary successes of Egypt was the full ownership that the Egyptian people felt for that transformation. That has served the Egyptian people well. It serves U.S. interests well. We did not see anti-American sentiment arising out of that movement in Egypt precisely because they felt that we hadn't tried to engineer or impose a particular outcome, but rather they owned it.
And the Venezuelan president, Hugo Chavez, continues to push his mediation plan despite the idea being rejected by Libyan opposition groups and Western governments. Protesters there have added their voices to the uprising, chanting slogans in support of the Libyan people. They condemn Chavez's proposal to work with Gaddafi, whom they labelled a murderer. The Venezuelan president accuses the United States of exaggerating the uprising. The director of the London School of Economics has resigned over deals he approved with the family of Colonel Muammar Gaddafi. Sir Edward Davis said the university's reputation had suffered as a result of the multi-million-dollar contract he'd accepted to train Libya's elite. An independent inquiry will examine the LSE's relationship with Libya and Gaddafi's son, Saif. Well, I'm joined now on set by Shadi Hamid, Director of Research at the Brookings Institute here in Doha and a specialist in Middle Eastern politics. Shadi, good to see you again. Let's just widen this out a bit if we can and talk about perhaps some of the prospects for success for this revolution in Libya. What's the difference between an uprising and a revolution, and how does this apply specifically to Libya?
Well, a revolution suggests that it succeeded. So it starts out an uprising, then it becomes something else. I mean, at this point, we don't know what's going to happen. There's a stalemate. The regime is not willing to back down, and obviously the protesters aren't going to back down. So an uprising could also turn into a civil war, and that's, I think, the real fear here. And that's what makes, I think, Libya quite different than Egypt or Tunisia. I don't think that's the right model for really understanding what's happening in Libya now. I think a more appropriate model might be Bosnia or Kosovo or Iraq after the first Gulf War, where we really see mass slaughter of civilians and two sides essentially fighting each other militarily.
Let's just talk about some of the international factors, Shadi. I mean, the proposed no-fly zone, the ICC says Gaddafi and his inner circle may have a case to answer for in terms of crimes against humanity. Obama's come out openly now and said Gaddafi should go. What impact is all of this having internationally, do you think?
Well, Obama's saying that we have to send a clear message to Gaddafi, but I think we're well beyond that. He's not listening to all these clear messages. He's not going to step down voluntarily. So I think the international community is going to have to think of what other options it has beyond sanctions or freezing assets. And obviously what's being discussed now is a no-fly zone. And it seems that there's some talk that Libyan rebels might actually make a formal request to the international community to intervene militarily and impose a no-fly zone. So if that happens, the U.S. and its allies will be in a difficult situation. Obama said that he wants to give Libyans full ownership. But what happens if Libyans themselves are looking to the U.S. and Europe for help?
Well, let's just talk about the legitimacy of this transitional council headed up by the former Justice Minister. I mean, how do people inside and outside of the country view the council? Do they see this perhaps as the face of the transition?
I wouldn't necessarily call it, it's still very early on. I mean, this transitional council is only a few days really in the making. But I think it's one of the formal faces of the uprising, because a lot of people are asking now, who's really heading this up? Where is the leadership? What happened in Libya started off leaderless. And now I think we're looking at a transition phase where they have to develop a leadership, a political plan, and be able to articulate their message to the international community, because the U.S. and Europe are asking, who do we talk to on the ground? So having something more formal that represents at least a certain sector of the Libyan people, I think, is an important step.
Let's just talk about the role, if we can, of the Arab League, because this contagion across the Middle East has very much put the focus back on the Arab League in terms of their role. The Arab League has called for no foreign intervention in the current uprising in Libya. But, I mean, does this call have any meaning, and will anyone listen to the Arab League?
The Arab League is trying to assert itself a little bit more. Amr Moussa has become more prominent because of his involvement in the Egyptian revolution. And Amr Moussa, the Secretary General, actually said that essentially all options are on the table, and that the Arab League will not stand by while their Libyan brothers are being slaughtered, and has even kept open the option of a no-fly zone. How the Arab League would go about imposing a no-fly zone isn't entirely clear. But up until now, the Arab League has been a glorified debating society.
Have they failed?
Failed. I don't think they haven't done much besides issue condemnations and public statements. The Arab League up until now hasn't had a lot of bite or binding authority. But they're trying. It's unclear how successful they'll be, but it's clear that Amr Moussa is trying to turn it from a debating society into something a little bit more.
All right, Shadi Ahmed, thank you very much indeed for your analysis. Now, in northern Yemen, it's reported at least 2 people have been killed and another 7 wounded after Shia Muslims say the military fired rockets at anti-government protests in Amran province. In Bahrain, several people have been injured in clashes between Sunni and majority Shia Muslims in the country. Youths armed with sticks and batons attacking each other on the streets of Hamad, that's south of the capital. It's the first time the two sides have openly clashed since protests demanding constitutional reforms began 2 weeks ago. Bahrain's opposition says it's ready to talk to the government. In Gaza, Hamas has called on people to rally against the Israeli siege in a display of Palestinian unity. There are estimates up to 10,000 could take to the streets later on Friday. And thousands of Egyptians are already gathering in Cairo's Tahrir Square to call for real constitutional change in the government. The country's new Prime Minister, Essam Sharaf, is expected to address the crowd. Let's cross live to our Egypt correspondent, Ayman Mohyeddin. He's there overlooking Tahrir Square. Ayman, we're seeing the pictures behind you. Thousands of people gathering already. What are we expecting to happen today there?
Well, Darren, you can probably hear behind me, that is the sermon, the Friday sermon has just gotten underway. Thousands of people are listening attentively. The sermon that is being delivered today, undoubtedly about politics in Egypt, calling on the ruling National Democratic Party, or the once ruling National Democratic Party, rather, to be disbanded and dissolved, and for all those senior officials who for so many years involved in corruption and exploitation of this country to be brought to justice. Now, we are expecting, according to the Facebook page of the Egyptian Prime Minister, we are expecting the new Prime Minister, Essam Sharaf, to make an appearance here at some point. Whether or not that happens shortly after Friday prayers or perhaps even later on in the day, still to be seen. But certainly it would be a very surprising change of events for an Egyptian politician of that caliber to come down here and address the crowds directly. It is an attempt, obviously, by the new leadership of this country to show that it is serious about real changes, because that is what the protesters behind me are demanding. They want real change, substantial change, not simply a cosmetic one.
And of course, Essam Sharaf has been tasked to form a new government. Ayman, do opposition groups broadly support his appointment?
Well, you know, certainly from the events that we've heard happened over the past several weeks, indeed he is a candidate, if you will, that had the consensus of the various revolutionary groups and some of the political forces that have been in direct talks with the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces. Now, as we understand it from those that were involved in the negotiations, the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces was entertaining the possibility of